What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some video games that I have been avoiding and why. Because as much as I enjoy people seeming to think that I can break the barriers of time itself, I in fact cannot, and some things inevitably have to get left behind. And time is often a pretty big factor in those decisions, but it really isn't the only one. To clarify a little bit of what I mean here, I am basically talking about video games that it seems like I would cover or review for one reason or another, but I'm obviously making a choice not to, or at least put them off, etc. Because yes, obviously there are a million video games I will never get around to. Thousands of them release every year. I'm lucky if I review 50 or 60 of them, and just on the sheer power of math, I'm not going to get to all of those. This video is again more about games that I am kind of deliberately putting off for one reason or another. Now, I did make a video like this a little over a year ago, I think at the very end of December in 2024 actually. And the reason I made that video, and also this one, is primarily because I have found that sort of like speaking these things out into the world tends to light a bit of a fire under me, and I am more inclined to get them done. From the last time I did something like this, I have done basically everything but XCOM 2 and the old gold box CRPGs, which I talked about. So we'll see, I guess, if I can have a similar level of success with these. But with all that stuff out of the way, let's actually dive fully into this. Kicking it off first with XCOM 2, actually. A sort of repeat here, but when I initially talked about this, I mentioned that XCOM 1 and 2 would be a very large effort. Not only do you have to play through those games many times over, there's also like online components you have to figure out. There's also the game's various versions via like its expansions and whatnot, and I actually did XCOM 1 last year, and it took an extremely long time. Not necessarily due to its own fault, I will add. I did get interrupted several times. It just kept taking longer than I was expecting it to, and I had to keep getting interrupted, and I eventually finally got that review done after starting in September of 2025 all the way at the very beginning of this year. Basically finally finished it up over the Christmas break. And XCOM 1 kind of wound up giving me a nice little preview to how long XCOM 2 is going to take, which is only more complicated. And so while I am very inclined to get around to actually, getting these done and reviewing them for the channel and making sure that like these sort of cornerstone games for that genre are on the channel in some form for people to check out, it is no small amount of effort to do that well. And to be completely honest with you guys, I'm still a little exhausted from doing the first one. And so the prospect of jumping straight into the second one is just far from my mind at the moment. I would love to get this done over the summer, to be honest with you, but we'll see what happens. I wouldn't be surprised if I go to do this one and it also gets interrupted multiple times again. Suffice to say, it's going to be a lot. But speaking of a lot, next up, in a very similar vein actually, we have the recently released Mewgenics. I kind of wanted to throw one in here that was a more recent game that I've been, again, obviously putting off and avoiding, but that's basically because Mewgenics is long. Truth be told, I'm not even like super committed to 100%ing this one, but the catch is, even if I wanted to do like a regular review of the game, the main story for this is meant to be like 200 hours long. Now, I'm the type of person that if I want to review a game, I don't necessarily need to 100% it. I don't think that's truly necessary. It's just something I enjoy doing. But what I do think is that provided it's a game where rolling credits is possible, there are some games like multiplayer games, etc., where even that doesn't really make a ton of sense. But in games where they can, in fact, be finished, I really think reviewers have a responsibility to do that. And in order to do even just that with Mewgenics, it's an extraordinary time commitment. And you add on top of that the fact of the veneer of the game being honestly a little bit gross. That's going to get grating over that period of time for me. It winds up being the type of experience that I get a little burnt out on before I've even started, and hence why I'm not really in a rush for this one. Now, what I might do is play this in like bits and pieces and eventually finish up the story as a result, but while I think it's possible I might eventually review this game, I don't think there's much of a chance of me 100%ing this one just for the sheer time investment involved. How long the main story is, etc. I just think there are other games I would want to play more in that span of time. rather than spending a colossal amount of time on a singular game. But it is fun, so I'll give it that. We'll see what happens with this one in the future, but it's just a lot. Now, this third entry is a little bit different, and truth be told, kind of one of the main reasons I decided to go ahead and make this video this time around, and that is actually Swordhaven. Swordhaven is a weird game, and what I mean by that is that everything around the launch of this game was just weird. It kind of seems like they took a bit of an unfinished game, dropped it in the middle of December without much rhyme or reason to that, no build-up or anything like that, with areas that were still actively undergoing like development and additions. There's a 1.1 update coming that's supposed to add some stuff that was promised from the Kickstarter. And I'll say straight away, it gave me a little bit of a weird vibe when they dropped it. Now, also, before we go any further, I did want to mention that I actually backed this game on Kickstarter, and the reason I did that is because the developer behind it, Atom Team, came up with Atom RPG, a Fallout-inspired CRPG that, while very rough around the edges, I enjoyed a lot. I wanted to see what they could do, having learned from that experience, and bringing it into the fantasy genre. But then all that stuff happened with what I just mentioned about it kind of just being unceremoniously dropped into 1.0 out of nowhere, and it was just a weird situation. Combine that with the fact that at the time at which they released it, I was already busy with several other things. But you see, up until relatively recently, that was just kind of a feeling I had, which is why I didn't make much of a mention of it. But the reason I'm mentioning it now in this video is that not all that long ago, Atom Team announced the development of Atom RPG 2, which seems to be relatively early on, but that just seemed like a very strange thing to do in the wake of, again, just kind of dropping this game when it's clearly not even done. Like, you have content yet to be added to it, and the game doesn't feel like it's in a 1.0 state. And when you combine those two things together, well, I obviously don't know this for sure. From the outside looking in, from my perspective, it does kind of seem like they just got tired of working on this one, dropped it so they could move on to the Atom RPG 2 that they wanted to make. I hope that's not true, but either way, they've still got some patches planned for this one. When it drops into 1.1, which is supposed to, I believe, add all the content that they have planned for this one, that's when I'm going to dive into it and review it in full. But basically, I've been avoiding this one because the situation around it is very, very strange. And with everything else going on, it was easy to just kind of take a step back and kind of see what happened with this first and go from there. But nonetheless, we are not done yet, because next up we have the Resident Evil series. Now, the reason I've been avoiding this series is primarily because it's a long-running franchise with a pretty dedicated fan base, and that's always a weird thing to step into from the perspective of an outsider who has to speak with at least some confidence of their own opinions in the form of things like reviews. It just makes for a weird situation. I've done that with other franchises. Just to give a recent example, I checked out the remake of the first Trails in the Sky game. I plan on playing more of those. But that's a franchise with a lot of fans who have very strong opinions about, the way it should be played, etc. And while I would not presume that this applies just blanketly to the entire Resident Evil fan base, I do kind of get that vibe from them as well. It seems like the kind of thing people have a lot of strong opinions about that I simply do not. Nonetheless, though, the reason I want to cover it at all, actually, is because last year in particular, 2025, I played a few survival horror games that I had a surprisingly good time with. And this might come as a surprise to you, but I haven't really played any of the Resident Evil games. I played 4 once with a friend, like way back in 8th grade, and I had seen my brothers play 2 before that. That is about my experience with Resident Evil. And with the recent release of Requiem, people have been asking me about it, plus my own experiences with those survival horror games last year. It's been on my mind. And yet, I do not just want to jump straight into the 9th entry and try to give any sort of review on that. What I will likely do is jump back to the remakes. I believe they remade the first few relatively recently and kind of go through those and see what's what. That's going to take time, a significant amount of it no less. I also don't like to play the same type of stuff back to back, so I really don't want to go 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And it's going to be difficult to space all of that out and also give myself a little space to actually kind of get to grips with what those games are, where people get their opinions about them from, that kind of thing. And it'll be interesting to see for my own perspective, to fill in that kind of gap in my own knowledge, but it's going to be a significant undertaking at the end of the day. That does bring us to our final entry, however, and it is none other than Fallout 76. So I believe I mentioned this a little bit at the end of the year. I'd have to double check, but Fallout 76 is a bit of an enigma for me because at this point I have played all of the mainline Fallout games, even some of the side ones, but the isometric CRPGs of 1 and 2, 3, 4, Fallout New Vegas, of course. I'm familiar with tactics, but haven't covered it on the channel, etc., etc. But a game I haven't really played at all is Fallout 76, and that is, if I'm being very, very honest, just the fact that it's a multiplayer game. It doesn't help that the game very famously launched in a pretty rough state that they eventually got around to fixing, but the fact that it was a multiplayer game combined with those launch issues made it a very easy skip for me at the time. But now, having covered almost all of the other Fallout games, it's getting a bit awkward that I haven't talked about this one for my own sake, because I kind of want to see what it's about. But then we run into the problems that are intrinsic to multiplayer games, and also kind of why I don't want to play them much at all to begin with, which is, to start with, the fact that it's been so long since this game released. 6 years, I believe, at this point, which it means that there's been a ton of content updates to this multiplayer game, which makes it very difficult to just jump in and play. And so while I was initially planning on covering it like a little bit, in taking a quick look at it, I immediately realized that was going to be a much larger project than I had anticipated, because I'm going to have to dive into it, get to grips with all of the new stuff, and everything it's going to throw in your face as a multiplayer game has been going on for that long. I also need to translate what that new player experience looks like when talking about that game. There's also tons of content to just cover all on its own, and it's something I want to do just out of my own pure curiosity, and again, it's like the only one I haven't done at this point. But you take all of that, you combine it with the fact that, as I just mentioned, those live service elements where it's getting updated constantly mean that within a handful of months it's probably going to be outdated anyway. And simply put, that is a lot of work to put into a video that might not even matter within, again, a handful of months or so. And I don't necessarily think that's like a huge problem or anything. I do think there is value in sharing what the new player experience for someone is in a game like this all these years later, etc., and talking about the mechanics from the perspective of somebody who hasn't been growing alongside them these days, things like that. But as I've hopefully laid out here, there is several different factors that make that a bit of a daunting prospect for me personally, even if it is something I want to do. But Fallout 76, like all of the other games on this particular list, I do hope to get to eventually, though it might take a good long while, which is, I think, where we're going to wrap up this particular video, which perhaps gave you a little glimpse into the sort of push and pull of how I try to schedule and account for all of these different games that I do play, which ironically isn't even a small fraction of the games that actually release, which makes the whole process a bit of a constantly moving target that I'm always aiming to nail. But with any luck, I'll get to these ones. But for today, that is pretty much going to do it. Certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If there's any games you've been just absolutely dying to play, avoiding, or just something you're having a ton of fun with, I would love to hear about it down in the comments section below, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.